This conference has been looking at a whole variety of critical challenges in the operations of a variety of social insurance programs related to unemployment insurance, Social Security, health insurance, and we've been looking at challenges related to finance, to access, administration, and delivery of services. Many of these operational challenges could be looked at in a discrete sort of way in terms of technical solutions. But the truth is that our debate on these discrete questions are framed and defined by the broader concept of social insurance. Now, the wrestling with these operational questions sometimes raises the question, why the social insurance? Why don't we just come up with a kind of nicely trimmed solution to what would seem as a discrete financing issue, for instance, related to unemployment insurance or Social Security? And so this question of why social insurance turns out to be absolutely foundational. And in thinking about this conference, we wanted to put that straight up and to try to wrestle with why social insurance was created and why it has been sustained. What are the effects of social insurance in terms of life circumstances, in terms of policy options that are on the table or perhaps off the table or subject to questions? The effects of social insurance in both organizing and mobilizing certain constituencies and perhaps leaving others unorganized and unrecognized. And then the question that we are always wrestling with, and has particular potency at this moment, which is how is social insurance relevant to the challenges of our moment, which are extreme. Today we are fortunate to have as our keynote this morning one of the premier students of social insurance, an expert on the effects and the history of social insurance. Theda Skocpol is a professor at Harvard in government sociology. Some of you may know that some decades ago, Theda's dissertation was published as a book. This is fairly uncommon. But more impressively, and at least in my experience, unheard of, won the premier book award in the profession. And that body of work continues to be seminal. In the last several decades, Theda has written extensively and in a path-breaking way about a whole range of issues related to social policy. Two of her more recent projects we've collaborated on. One is a book on healthcare reform and American politics, which is on display over here, and a project we've just wrapping up with the Russell Sage Foundation called Reaching for the New Deal, which looks at Barack Obama's first 2 years in office across 8 policy areas. And you can look at that online, and that will be published as a book in the future. Her current new project is on the Tea Party movement. There is an extensive bio, and you can look through it. I won't go through that. Professor Skocpol is going to make a presentation, about 20 minutes. Then there will be questions. We've got mics over here. We've got mics that wander and so forth. Please give a warm welcome, Professor Theda Skocpol.
Well, thank you, and it's a great pleasure to be here. I mean, I've been a member of the National Academy of Social Insurance for many years, and I know it does God's work, so I'm delighted to have a chance to engage in a dialogue with all of you. So let me talk for a little bit and then open the floor for your insights as well as questions. As I got ready to carry through this assignment from Larry Jacobs, Why Social Insurance, I got out my copy of the 50th anniversary edition of the report of the Committee on Economic Security of 1935. And you have to understand that from my perspective, that's not the beginning of the story, that's the late middle of the story. I know, because I study things in much longer timelines than a mere 50 to 75 years. But the introductory essay to this volume by Wilbur Cohen, who we miss, many of us, gets to the part where he's talking about the overall understanding and rationale we should have about Social Security. And very strikingly, that section is labeled a mechanism of personal freedom. And I'll just quote briefly from Cohen. There are many ways to look at Social Security. Some view it simply as an income transfer program and support or oppose it as a redistribution of income program. There are those who view it solely from a budgetary or fiscal standpoint with regard to its impact on savings, investments, and productivity. Others fear it as a curtailment of individual freedom and choice. But, he says, Social Security can also be seen in a broader context, not merely as a government payment, but as a mechanism to give individuals greater freedom in their personal lives when they experience one of the major vicissitudes of life. It is a way of assuring the dignity and independence of the individual, the integrity of the family, and the stability and purchasing power of the community. Well, I think all of the arguments for and against Social Security, health insurance that Cohen was referring to in that striking quote are once again bubbling up in our national discourse. We know that that has happened every time a major social program has been launched or has gone through some kind of turning point debate in our politics. And the full range of thinking about social programs, and especially social insurance programs, is certainly with us again. We have debates about a fiscal commission that sees Social Security mainly in the context of public accounting and the possibility of jiggering with the formulas for redistributive purposes. And we have a Tea Party movement that actually isn't against Social Security. I'll be happy to talk about that if you like, but tends to see many social programs as illegitimate redistribution of the taxes of some to pay for the care of others. And as usual, we have the full clash of moral and political debate. Now, what I would like to do is take this occasion to go back a little bit and talk about the moral framing and the democratic, small d democratic, political understandings that have been embodied in some of the most successful U.S. social programs, particularly Social Security, the American version of social insurance, and bring the debate up to the present by talking about some of the ways in which these issues lurk in our debates about the Affordable Care Act in a very different and less politically compelling form. Let me start by talking a little bit about Social Security. Social Security is, in one sense, a belated U.S. version of an idea that originated in Germany and England in the late 19th and early 20th century. The idea that the powers of government could be used in what many of the German-educated intellectuals of the early 20th century saw as an ethical way to create a savings mechanism that would enable working people who worked often for very low wages and under tough conditions to, in a shared and compelled way, be prepared for vicissitudes like unemployment, ill health, which was an interruption of family income, as well as a need for care on the part of the sick person, and of course old age, which was, if you were lucky enough to get to it in the early 20th century, in some ways a mixed blessing because of the loss of earning power that it brought to the individual and their family. Now that idea of social insurance, growing out of German-inspired ethical statism or Fabian ideas in England, was brought into the United States, championed by the American Association of Labor Legislation, a group very much like the National Academy of Social Insurance, people who were engaged in social programs or were intellectuals in universities who thought about them, or experts who calculated things for governments. The AALL would be the forerunner of NASI, I would say. And that organization championed workmen's compensation, health insurance ideas, to some degree unemployment insurance ideas growing out of these European ideas. But of course they came to very little in the 1910s when the AALL was at its peak. And you could say that in some ways the versions of social insurance being championed by these worthy intellectuals were a little too European for the American context, a little too willing to talk overtly about the use of state power. They used the word state, and they didn't mean Maryland either. And a little bit too willing to talk about compulsion. So there were many reasons that their campaigns fell short, but by the time the ideas came again to the fore in the debates about what to do about family and individual security coming out of the Great Depression of the 1930s, I'm prepared to argue that social insurance had become more Americanized in the way in which its proponents talked about it, and certainly in the way the American democratic citizenry would think about the premier program to come out of the 1930s, the Social Security Act of 1935. What do I mean by that? Well, as we know in Social Security, national government power was definitely used to set up, sustain, and drive forward the program from 1935 until now. But unlike the proposals in the 1910s, there were no direct general revenue tax contributions to Social Security. It was set up with the idea that there would be, quote, contributions, unquote, from employees and employers to build up a fund from which people could then make legitimate claims in their retirement and in due course for their surviving spouse after 1939, and later if they became disabled. That was true from the 50s forward. So in some ways, both the structure of social insurance and the way of thinking about it moved in a direction that allowed it to tap into long-standing American democratic popular ideas that have again and again in U.S. history been used to justify massive publicly funded programs to promote opportunity and security for large numbers of American citizens. I developed this argument, this formula for success, political, small d democratic success, in a book called The Missing Middle some years ago. The kinds of things that have been supported and understood since public education spread across the United States in the 19th century, since support for mothers, children, and families was spread across many U.S. states in the 1910s, then with Social Security, later with Medicare, and of course with the giant military veterans benefits programs that grew out of the Civil War, and again with the GI Bill of 1944. These kinds of programs always had behind them certain key elements. They were understood as ways in which individuals who had given to the community or national interest or were preparing to were supported in turn by the community. That's a key American idea. It's as American as apple pie. There's nothing German, English, Swiss, or Canadian about it, let alone Nazi. The programs bridged the middle class and the poor, were not presented as anti-poverty programs, even though many of them did a great deal to lift well-being for the poor or the near poor in the United States. And of course they had other parts of their success, but those are the key ones for my purposes. Now, as many of you may know, and it's important to keep in mind in today's climate, the early phases of Social Security from 1935 to the middle of the 1950s were contested. The law was passed, but it was 20 years before it was a sure thing that social insurance for the retired, elderly, spouses, and the disabled would survive. The fights were over whether the taxes should be raised to support the program, and they were suspended during World War II. And from left and right alike, there was an attempt to dismantle or starve Social Security and have more targeted programs on the very poor alone. That story has been told by various scholars, and it's important to realize that, yes, the conservatives of the day were very wary about the idea of a social insurance program that would include the middle class as well as the poor, and wanted to have simply programs for the very poor, which could be politically controlled and fiscally controlled much more successfully, they felt. But many of the progressives or liberals of the day also wanted to skip the middle class, not waste money on the middle class, but promote programs that were distributive toward the very poor, and in their case not thinking very much about the conservative rationale that it would be easy to starve such programs for support. So it wasn't really until the 1950s, and then again especially with the reforms of the 1970s, that Social Security became what we know of it today. By then, most Americans were part of the program. It was mildly redistributive on the benefits side. It became the most important engine for pulling people out of poverty. I don't have to tell people in the room that, but it was not labeled a poverty program, and that was critical. To this day, vast majorities of Americans of all age groups, Democrats, Republicans, Independents, and even Tea Party people continue to love and support this conception of Social Security. And there are two further points to make here, drawing on the work of Andrea Campbell at MIT. It's not just the benefits, the shared benefits, that are liked by people. Social Security's payroll tax, the dedicated tax that was designed to create a flow of revenue to support the program over the long run, is also relatively popular with the American public. The recent tax reform, when the components were broken down and people were asked about them, the payroll tax reducing the payroll tax deduction was not even popular with the majority of Americans. Yes, it would put more money in people's paychecks, but they didn't want to endanger Social Security. And a very striking poll, one of many, just taken recently, people were asked, currently workers pay Social Security payroll taxes up to $6,800 of their salary. To ensure the long-run viability of Social Security, would you rather have people pay Social Security taxes on salaries above that amount, or would you rather see benefits cut and the retirement age increase to age 69? Overall, 77% of Americans want to raise the payroll tax, 10% want to cut benefits. The least enthusiastic group are Tea Party identifiers. 67% of them want to raise the payroll tax to support Social Security over the long run, and only 20% want to cut it. So this program, in both its benefit structure and its taxation, is popular with Americans. Who isn't it popular with? Experts who live in Washington, D.C. and New York. And they are profoundly out of sync with the democratic, small d, democratic will of the American people on this matter, and would have been very dismayed if President Obama had not spoken up for Social Security in his State of the Union address. Now, let me say a little bit about health insurance and then stop and open the floor for discussion. Health insurance, of course, is as Jacob Hacker and others have told us at great length, a very different story from the story of Social Security. Whether early or late, attempts to create a broadly shared, publicly regulated or tax-funded health insurance program that would support working people and their families, ranging from the middle class to the poor, those efforts failed. That was the first effort of the American Association of Labor legislation. It failed. It failed again in the 1930s twice. It failed in 1946. It failed. I mean, it failed so many times that it's hard to keep count. And the part of that idea that survived, of course, was Medicare in 1965, and most of those who championed Medicare in 1965, as some of you in this room will recall, hoped that it would be an entering wedge, to go from a broadly shared Medicare program for the retired elderly, that it wouldn't be difficult to move that down the age structure or perhaps to include children, and then move toward working-aged people who didn't have employer-based insurance. That hasn't happened, and in the recent debates that we've had in this country leading up to the passage of the Affordable Care Act of March of 2010, and the intense debates ongoing about what happens to it as it moves toward implementation, debates that are going to be with us for another 5 to 10 years for sure, I think we can see very clearly the absence of any kind of rationale of the kind that tapped into popular understandings of individual contributions and community support in return that came to be embodied so successfully in Social Security. The Affordable Care Act can certainly be seen as a successful, on paper, attempt to complete the universal contributory project in health insurance. It is a powerful piece of legislation that, when implemented, will provide basic health coverage to a large proportion of those currently uninsured and fill in the gaps in the employer system and in the public programs for the elderly and the poor that have existed and were growing prior to 2008. But the Affordable Care Act, by its supporters, has not been presented in public terms that are comparable to the rationales offered for successful social programs and social insurance programs in the past. It has been presented to the degree that it has been presented at all as a cost-saving measure for the nation, as a series of rules for insurance companies, and in embarrassed, quiet conversations, its supporters will admit that it will also provide coverage for the uninsured. Even that goal has been downplayed. And I think that opportunities have been missed for things like the individual mandate. The individual mandate has been presented in a way that allows it to be argued as an infringement on individual freedom, rather than the common sense way to present it, which would be everybody pitches in and everybody has a right to the protections or the benefits of the Act. When have you heard anyone say that? And yet that's the best way to communicate it to everyday Americans, the way that people can relate to in their experience of other public programs at all levels of government that they like. So let me stop here. I know I'm supposed to, and I'm going to. I think it's important, as we argue about the trees, the leaves on the trees, even the veins in the leaves on the trees, about whether to modify Social Security going forward, whether to hand it to those who would like to fiddle with it and turn it into a less costly, more poverty-oriented program on the one hand, as we engage in the discussions about what the Affordable Care Act should do, can do, and how it should be understood. I think it's important to remember the long tradition of impassioned, morally infused discussion about social insurance that is native to the United States. It is an interesting, rich, worthy tradition. Go back and read what some of those people in the 1910s and the 1930s had to say. All of them thought of themselves as being part of a broad, democratically engaged social movement to create a more secure society that would enhance the freedom, ultimately, the individual freedom of workers and people in their families. I think that tradition is still relevant today. Has to be thought of perhaps in some new ways, but it's important for policy-engaged intellectuals to remember the moral groundings of the discussion and to remember the need to speak in understandable ways to our fellow citizens across the partisan and political spectrum. So, stop with that.
We've got microphones over here and over here. If you want a microphone to come to you, just raise your hand. We've got wandering mics. I think we've got someone queuing up right over here, but space over here. Yep.
Hi, Rob Hudson from Washington University.
Hi.
I was very taken by the missing middle. I've assigned it repeatedly. The middle idea I understand around income, the idea that we want to hopefully move people from just poverty folks up into some measure of the middle class. My interest is in the life cycle aspect of it. If you go to Title I of the Social Security Act, you go to Medicare, you go to the Family Assistance Plan turning into SSI, it seems to me, in a phrase I used years ago, that the elderly have sort of been an ideological loss leader for all sorts of stuff we've tried to do, and still it really does, certainly in comparison to any place else, is a very heavily weighted old age welfare state. So in terms of the middle, it seems to me we've been, by American standards, generous to the elderly, with S-CHIP and some things around Medicaid, putting TANF aside for the moment. We've been somewhat nice toward children, though we don't like their parents. But we have not been very nice to people aged 18 to 65, not only around health, but especially around mental health. And so what is your take on what American social policy thinks about middle-aged people?
Okay, thanks for asking that. You know, in The Missing Middle, the title of that book, when I wrote it, was deliberately ambiguous on this score. Was I talking about middle income, or was I talking about middle of life? And I was talking about both. Now, I have two answers to your question, though. One is, if you look, as I do, at the long run and the biggest picture of American social policy, it's not that the United States has some aversion to offering opportunity and security to the non-elderly, because some of our most important social programs, justified exactly in versions of the individual contribution, community support framework that I suggested, has resonated throughout American democratic history, were public schools and the GI Bill. The GI Bill, as you recall, was a massive engine of support, opportunity, education, support for founding businesses, farms, offered to about half the generation of returning men at World War II. So these were, and it included support for their young family formation. So now, we don't think of that, I guess, as social insurance, and I'm not saying it is. But I am saying that we know there have been moments in American history where talking about supporting people in the middle working years of life and family forming years has been popular and has resonated. We can understand the Affordable Care Act, I think, as an effort to reach out to that group as well, because most of the uninsured, or the shall we say, precariously insured, are in working families, working for small businesses or for hard-pressed employers, and they certainly aren't in the categories of the very, very poor reached by Medicaid prior to 2008, or the elderly. But nobody has explained it that way to average Americans, have they? So we don't know that the explanation would fail. It might make quite a lot of sense to people.
Anna Rappaport, actuary. I have a couple of questions for you built around some things to me that seem to be powerful observations. There are a significant number of people, when we think about old age security, who have nothing else than Social Security. I don't believe that's going to change, and I see a big concern personally around the unbanked. But we see a great deal of emphasis on financial literacy and the importance of training people. I must admit that while I think literacy and training is very important, I'm very skeptical about how far one can get in terms of improving security through financial literacy efforts, and I'd be quite interested as to how you see that fitting in.
Well, you know, that argument about the poor should, or the middle class should just save for their old age is, boy, that's an old staple. Go back and read the debates of the 1910s, and it'll sound like you just turned on the television set. You might have to translate a few words, but not really. You know, I think that if you take seriously the history of Social Security, you can feel perfectly fine about the idea that there should be opportunities for people to understand how to save if they have the income to do it, if they have the employment setting that facilitates it. We know that fewer and fewer Americans do have that. But anything that's done that would be seen as a substitute for or as a replacement for the broadly shared mechanism of contributions and entitlement to claim the benefit, which is supported by Americans in part because it is somewhat adjusted to what they earned during their working lifetime. Yes, it pulls up the bottom, and I think people do understand that, but they understand that if you earn more, you're going to get more. You won't be surprised that I feel that when you've got a program the public thinks it understands, would it pass muster in the Harvard Economics Department, their understanding? Probably not, but that's fine with me. When you have a program people think they understand, they think it is a good thing, they are prepared to pay as well as take from it, the expert and politician class should think 25 times before it undermines that, rather than building on it. So that's my view, and my view, of course, is political, but it's also based on an understanding. I think one of the things that in policy studies we do too little of is to think about how the public can understand what is being offered. And one of the big problems with the Affordable Care Act is that people have no idea what is in it. They have no idea what's in it, partly because nobody's told them, or they've told them lies. That's a technical term, lie. But it's also because it's an incredibly complex set of subsidies, regulations, taxes, and fees that is hard to sum up in some ways, and is filling in the gaps in a system, an underlying system that was already very complex. So if one doesn't have to deal with that, if one can build on something that's understandable, and that's what they did in Medicare back in 1965. They created an analogy to Social Security that helped to make Medicare more comfortable, even in a highly politically and ideologically polarized environment. Was the analogy completely accurate? No, but it rhymed. And in politics, rhyming is good enough.
Yeah, John Tambernino, Social Security Administration, on detail to Congressman Jim McDermott's office. You talked about the popularity of the payroll tax. As you know, the December tax cuts included an unprecedented 2% reduction, or rather one-third reduction, in that employee payroll tax. Many economists think that that was good policy. As a political scientist, do you think that that's good politics? And it seems to me the things that, the possibilities that it creates are the precedent to manipulate the payroll tax for purposes of short-term economic stimulus or political benefit in a way that really undermines the long-term solvency and management of the Social Security program. It's going to be difficult to reinstate potentially, since it will be perceived as a tax increase in the same way the other tax increases were perceived as such. It coincides with Congressman Paul Ryan's proposal to establish personal accounts with 2% of the employee contribution for the payroll tax. So talk about the politics of this and its implications for the stability of and popularity of the Social Security program.
Well, look, I think you're right that a political scientist, particularly my kind, a historical institutionalist who thinks about some of these dimensions of understandability and broad coalitions behind policy, will look at the trade-offs very differently from economists. one of the things that worries me is not that economists are advising policymakers. I actually do worry about that, but I will try to be universalist and say that I don't worry about that. But I do worry that policymakers don't have experts who know about these other things saying, wait a minute, what about this? I mean, the same problem occurred with the Obama tax cuts, where the behavioral economists said, dribble it out a little bit each week so they don't notice it. They thought that was good stimulus policy. It happens to be disastrous electoral policy, since most Americans went into the 2010 election not knowing they'd gotten a tax cut. And one of my students is studying that paradox. You're right that the payroll tax deduction could create all those problems, but let me urge you and your colleagues in Congress not to assume that. Public opinion shows the public didn't really particularly like the payroll deduction. That means that even if Paul Ryan and Tea Party Express are yelling all the time about it being a tax increase to reinstate, there's plenty of basis there for saying we need to go back to collecting the contributions that keep Social Security strong. Write that phrase down and take it back to, I know Jim McDermott knows that already. I think sometimes in Washington and in Congress, people think perception is what's being yelled on Fox News and debated on MSNBC. Perception at the level of popular attitudes on taxes does not really regard the payroll tax for Social Security in the same way as it regards other taxes. So it should be perfectly possible to go back to collecting the contributions we need to keep Social Security strong. And I just reported to you those poll findings, which many other polls have found, that public would like people like me to keep paying all year. And I'd like to. I'd like to pay the payroll tax on my full income. And you might find a fair number, even when you break down by income levels. Those making more than $100,000 a year, it was 72% in favor of raising the payroll tax cap to 18% for cutting benefits.
Hi. Theda, you were talking about the moral framings that were successful in American history for social programs, you know, equality of opportunity through the educational expansion of public education in the 19th century, or contributions to society through, you know, the early forms of welfare in the 1930s, or the veterans' contributions to society. And then you said with Social Security you have this contributory paradigm as well, where you're earning a benefit because you're paying into it, so you get a right to benefits. It seems like there's no paradigm in U.S. political culture based on need, it seems, just because you need it.
That's correct.
Right. And so it seems like with the Affordable Care Act, there's a problem because the key expansion involved is to people who are getting these subsidies, to, you know, expanding coverage to a lot of people who probably don't have labor force attachment.
Oh, but they do for the most part.
They do for the most part?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the uninsured are heavily in low wage and lower middle wage working families, working for small businesses. Okay. Absolutely. Well, and in fact, most of them are highly sympathetic people in terms of this understanding that you shouldn't be working, raising your family, contributing to the society, and not be able to claim this kind of basic support.
Okay, because that was my question, was how to frame that, but you're saying that you can frame that based on contribution to society. These people are working hard, so they have a right. Okay.
Absolutely, and let me stress something. I mean, I think in our current expert discourse, we have moved this into a highly technical economic frame, and we see contribution as a monetary contribution. And of course, it is that, and it's important that people are paying the taxes to make these programs possible. But in the popular moral framing that I'm talking about, and you know, I'm not talking based on nothing. I mean, I've got evidence for this, historical evidence and poll evidence in more recent times, and in-depth interview evidence, which in some ways is even better. The claim comes from being an upright citizen who works and meets their responsibilities. Family responsibilities, and the responsibilities to help defend the nation in time of war. So contribution, if you talk to regular Americans about Social Security, I just came back from talking to Tea Partiers in Virginia, and what they tell me is, I worked all my life. I earned that. And they don't mean I've added up the total number of taxes I put in and figured out the return I ought to get. That's not, they're not bond traders, or that they are saying I contributed through a lifetime. And they go on about the ways they contributed, including by caring for people in their families. And that's what creates the entitlement. Now, Americans are very creative, and over the decades have found many ways to take this framing and connect it to legitimating community support for almost everyone. And some of you may be saying, well, there's a few folks who will be left out. If I speak in an academic audience, people will get up and say, what about the despised poor, you know, who aren't doing anything? Well, you know, I'd like it if we could get to a situation where they were the only ones left out. And then I think we could probably figure out a way to handle that.
We've got time, just one more question here, then I want to ask the last question.
Okay, Paul Cullen, an independent consultant. I'd like to question your, or be more skeptical about the polls than you are. Let me pose 4 questions for the American people and for this room. 1, is the American taxpayer overtaxed? 2, are earmarks a major cause of deficits? 3, is international affairs spending a major cause of deficits? 4, do you approve of the liberalization of the estate tax? My guess is that the population would say yes to all of those, and this room would say no to all of those. So your disparagement of the policy community in Washington, I think, seems to be unduly harsh.
Well, look, I'm a professor and an expert. I am certainly not saying that experts, Washington experts, university-based experts, don't have things to offer. I don't believe that at all. I'm here as an expert. And when we are dealing with public opinion, we have to do more than wave around one poll result. That's for sure. Because out of context questions about abstract things that people have no experience of lead to very, very weird answers. And the answer about, you know, a large part of a public spending being going to foreign aid is really a wonderful case in point. But the closer you get to people's concrete experience with something, and let's remember, most Americans have had experience with Social Security in their families for quite a long time now. They've had a chance to think about its impact on them, their family, their mother, their father, their grandfather, their neighbor. They've had a chance to think about whether they think it makes sense, how it's paid for, and how the claims are made on it. They've even had a chance to think about whether it's a demeaning experience to go apply for it, which is another thing that the expert literature has found matters in people's attitudes toward different social programs. So all I'm saying is that in that particular case, I think it fits what's been known in public opinion studies for a long time, that the closer you get to concrete things that people have actually had experience on, the more robust and reliable the opinion is. And I'm certainly not saying that all experts in Washington are in a different place than the public on this. In fact, I bet a lot of people in this room are in the same place. They think Social Security is a valuable program and they understand the reasons why. All I'm saying is that part of thinking about it is to think about how it's understood, what messages it gives to people about dignified citizenship and contributions to the society, go beyond the question of simply whether it delivers a certain number of dollars or takes a certain number of dollars. It's a further set of expert understandings that we need to take into account to understand how Social Security is grounded in American society and democracy. That's my point.
almost out of time. I want to first give a footnote for what you just said. Faye Cook, who's here, Faye Cook and I have written a series of things on just this point about knowledge about Social Security. We've just had a piece come out in the Journal of Politics. I think it's the first piece that's looked at the impact of the personal Social Security statement on knowledge and confidence in the program. If you're interested in this question, there's actually now a growing body of evidence of it, and Professor Skocpol is actually straight on point on this. But Professor Skocpol, I want to ask you... Theda. Yeah. Okay. I know that. I'm being deferential. I want to ask you a question about the politics of Social Security. Often, particularly in Washington, there's a heightened sense of the organized and effective representation of the recipients of Social Security. When you think about the Affordable Care Act, what should we be looking for in terms of future development of constituents who may not be organized now, may be fairly diffuse, and how that might form? Because at this point, it kind of looks like a ship that's been put out at ocean, and there's really not, for large parts of it, much of a constituency.
Well, I mean, Larry is alluding to, Professor Jacobs is alluding to the literature on policy feedbacks, which is an expert literature, and I'd be happy to talk with people about it if you're interested in it. Andrea Campbell at MIT, I mentioned earlier, has done a wonderful book about how Social Security not only has the various kinds of messages to citizens and understandings in the citizenry that I've talked about. Of course, it delivers benefits that are critical to allowing older people and their children to maintain greater independence in life. It also has helped to mobilize older voters to vote so that the pattern we see in American politics among under 65-year-olds, which is a sharp educational and income gradient in voting and other acts of individual participation, favoring the privileged over the less privileged, is not nearly as steep in the elderly population. Older people of lower middle and lower income are paying attention to politics. They vote at higher rates. And she traces it. She shows with careful quantitative analysis that much of that is attributable to their experiences with Social Security in every dimension. Now, when we come to the Affordable Care Act, one of the dilemmas that Larry and I talk about in our book, Healthcare Reform in American Politics, What Everyone Needs to Know, an inexpensive paperback, that on Amazon they say is a riveting read that they couldn't put down. It's written in regular people speak, but it's got sophisticated points in it. And one of the things we talk about is both in the enactment of this legislation and now in the fights over its implementation, it's a tough sled because of the imbalance of attention and mobilization. The groups and segments of the population that already had a strong stake in the delivery of health care, in the profits in the health care system, and of course in the benefits that went to trade unionists or to older Americans, have been very attentive and very prepared to notice any little tweak in their situation. And of course, to pass this law in a fiscally constrained environment, there were plenty of tweaks in their situations written into the law to squeeze out the resources and to modify the behavior of insurance companies so as to reach a precariously or uninsured population that is disproportionately lower income, young, persons of color, small businesses, lower middle income people. These are the least organized and the least attentive constituencies. But as this law goes into effect, and it's going into effect, step by step, a lot of it in the states, many of those who benefit from the new regulations and the new subsidies and the extensions of Medicaid and their supporters and advocates, especially in the states, but even in the business community, will understand what they're gaining more concretely and will become more attentive, more mobilized, and less willing to see things rolled back or taken away. That's an uneven process. It's a David versus Goliath process, but David is going to be bulking up a bit. and some of the Goliaths will be fighting with one another. Another Goliath will arrive, a few more. So I think that's one way to think about it as it moves forward. The implementation of the law changes understandings, affects the interests and goals of mobilized groups, sometimes even creates mobilizable constituencies. It's not just that those things feed into a legal battle, they also come out of landmark legislation like this. It happened with Social Security in very different ways. It's happened with Medicare, and it will happen with the Affordable Care Act. It already is.
We've got a very lively debate about to transpire here on Social Security, on retirement approaches. But please join me in thanking Professor Skocpol for a tour de force. Thank you very much.
Is this what we wanted?
Perfect. That's great.
Thanks a lot. Great question.